Okay, and now we can begin. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another teach-in. My name is Travis Huney, and I'm a second-year fine arts student with an interest in labor studies, and I'm also an organizer with Students Supporting UMFA. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'm going to read Students Supporting UMFA's land acknowledgement. The University of Manitoba, where many of us who gather here today study, is a colonial structure built on traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji-Cree nations, who are the first and rightful inhabitants of these lands. The water that sustains us here comes from Shoal Lake. As the first university to be established in what is now called Western Canada, we recognize the university's historical and ongoing role to enable violence and oppression that Indigenous people have suffered and continue to suffer. Our programs privilege and perpetuate colonial ideologies that value Eurocentric forms and erase Indigenous knowledge systems independent of and existing prior to dominant Western knowledge. Our academic relationships are embedded with power relations structured by colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. It is through the university's ongoing and growing relationship with the neoliberal state and global capitalism that colonization and violence against Indigenous people is inseparable from the academic institution that is now called the University of Manitoba. So I will now introduce our speaker, Dr. Sean Carleton. Dr. Carleton is an assistant professor in the Departments of History and Indigenous Studies. He is a settler scholar whose work examines the histories of colonialism, capitalism, and schooling in Canada. So we'll save questions for when we open up discussion following Dr. Carleton's talk. And if you have a question during the talk, you could type it in the chat and we'll make sure it gets raised later on. But Dr. Carleton, I will now pass it on to you.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Travis, for the introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming and to those watching the recorded version of this talk. Online, which I've called "Which Side Are You On? Lessons from the Winnipeg General Strike." And let me just share my PowerPoint with you here. Okay, well, for my teaching contribution, what I want to talk about is another big strike that took place in Winnipeg, Manitoba, that just so happened to coincide with a major global pandemic. That's right, it's happened twice. What are the chances? Yes, we're talking about the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, which coincided with the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. So you've probably seen some of these photos. But before we dive into the history, I want to start with a song. So originally I designed this talk thinking we'd be on the picket line together. But I can still make it feel that way by starting off with the famous labor song, "Which Side Are You On?" So let me switch this out. Give me a second. Make sure that sound's on.
From all of you good workers, good news to you I'll tell of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
My daddy was a miner and I'm a miner's son, and I'll stick with the Union till every battle's won.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
They say in Harlan County there are no neutrals there. You'll either be a Union man or a thug for J.H. Blair.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Oh, workers, can you stand it? Oh, tell me how you can. Will you be a lousy scab or will you be a man?
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Don't scab for the bosses, don't listen to their lies. Us poor folks haven't got a chance unless we organize.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Okay, that was Pete Seeger singing Which Side Are You On, which was written by Florence Reese, a union activist organizing mine workers in Kentucky in the 1930s. And the big takeaway from that song, aside from it sounds like a Disney movie song from the 50s, is that in conflicts, such as strikes, you have to pick a side. You can't be neutral, as one of the lyrics noted. Indeed, historian Howard Zinn always said that you can't be neutral on a moving train. And my colleagues Nigon Sinclair and David Parent noted in their teach-in presentation that kicked off this series that strikes can be frustrating and disruptive. And as Julia Smith noted in her teach-in talk on Monday, that's the purpose, right? Strikes are powerful tools of protest that inevitably force people to choose sides in a dispute. In other words, when you are confronted with these big momentous occasions, you are forced into a situation where you need to choose. Which side are you on? This is something perhaps you or your friends or your classmates have been feeling and talking about in recent weeks as you learn more about the issues of the UMFA strike and how they affect you as students, but also how they affect your instructors and how all of this affects U of M, Winnipeg, and Manitobans as well. You have to choose. Which side are you on? Well, the same thing happened in Winnipeg 100 years ago in 1919, when a strike by metal and building trades workers ballooned into a massive general strike of over 30,000 Winnipeggers and many more in solidarity. People had to choose sides, as tough as that is to do sometimes. Did you support the strike and the strikers in their demands for fair bargaining with their employers, or did you support the government, bosses, and police trying to contain and end the strike and protect the status quo and those who benefit from it? My main point today will be that understanding history can help you figure out which side are you on or want to be on. That's because history is an important resource for people who want to change the world and make it better. Working class history in particular, looking at the experiences, stories, and struggles of ordinary working people, is a useful organizing tool. Understanding past labor battles can help workers and allies develop successful tactics and strategies to improve their lives and build a better world today. Looking backwards can sometimes clarify the way forward. This does not mean, however, that we should simply want to reproduce the past. Life is rarely that straightforward. Even if replication were possible, it would not be advisable. And the Winnipeg General Strike is a case in point. The inspiring 6-week general sympathetic strike that saw 35,000 workers walk off the job ultimately ended in defeat, at least understood in the short term. The strike was violently crushed by police in collusion with state officials and business leaders in Winnipeg and with influence outside of Manitoba. Still, we can learn a lot from the Winnipeg General Strike and the positive ripple effects it had in Manitoba and beyond, which I'll talk about. So we can still find inspiration and guidance in understanding the history of this strike. As Julia mentioned on Monday, labor and feminist activist Madeleine Perrant once stressed that every labor battle teaches a worker how to fight. Nothing is ever completely lost. So with that, What I want to do today is outline the history of the Winnipeg General Strike, including some interesting U of M connections that I've recently uncovered, and use that history to highlight a number of important lessons that we can learn from today as we live through another big strike in Winnipeg during a global pandemic. And here I've got on the screen a UM student meme from early days, I think in the first week of the strike, again, referencing the Winnipeg General Strike. This is actually a historical photo from the strike's climax on Bloody Saturday, which I'll talk about. But in the tradition of me making kind of making connections to student and UMFA solidarity, challenging U of M and the Manitoba government here represented in the streetcar to give us a fair deal. So if nothing else, my talk today will help you understand this meme a bit better by giving you that all-important context. Okay, first things first, how many people have heard of the Winnipeg General Strike before? Just maybe wave at me or raise your hand in the raise your hand function. Okay, quite a few of you. That's great, but not everybody. So for those of you who haven't or maybe need a refresher, let's start at the beginning. In May and June of 1919, 35,000 workers in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory, and the homeland of the Métis Nation staged a 6-week general strike. Workers from various backgrounds withdrew their labor power. They went on strike to demand higher wages, collective bargaining rights, and more power for working people. 100 years later, the Winnipeg General Strike remains one of the largest and most important strikes in Canadian history. Now, the Winnipeg General Strike needs to be understood not narrowly, but more broadly as part of the longer history of colonial conflict, capitalist development, and class polarization in what is today known as Western Canada. By the early 1900s, a number of aggressive businessmen, including some who participated in the Government of Canada's violent efforts to dispossess Indigenous communities from their land, such as James Henry Ashdown, had come west to pursue industrialization. Over time, they shaped the development of Winnipeg for their benefit. The city became increasingly divided along class lines, with parts of the West End and the North End being majority working class, and most of the city's business and political elite living south of the river in Crescentwood. And again, the photos here kind of show you that polarization. The one on the top left is young children living in the interior of a home in Winnipeg's North End. And in the bottom right is the interior of prominent businessman and politician James Henry Ashdown. And you can see the stark difference of these two homes. So this situation of polarization and inequality worsened during and after World War I, which happened between 1914 and 1918. Many working class men went off to fight in the fields of Europe, while capitalists like Ashdown stayed home and profited from wartime production. Soldiers hoped to enjoy a more equal and democratic society when they returned home, but instead they faced high rates of unemployment and inflation. As well as my U of M history colleague Essel Jones has written about, there was also a global pandemic raging in the winter and spring of 1918-1919, known as the influenza or flu pandemic, which hit Western Canada especially hard and killed more than 50,000 people in Canada and at least 50 million people globally. Many of them poor and working class folks who had little access to healthcare at the time. So all of that adds fuel to this. Employer indifference to these kinds of hardships and rising inequality and their refusal to recognize unions and to bargain fairly with workers further fanned the flames of discontent. People were mad. And, after living through the past 20 months, I can relate a little bit. Obviously, things are much different than they were 100 years ago, but I can empathize with that feeling of anger and frustration, as well as the feeling that sacrifice should be worth it, right? That there should be a better future coming out of a difficult period and being really willing to fight for it. So when Winnipeg's building and metal trades workers went on strike on the 1st of May, 1919, other unions in the city decided, you know what, we're going to join them in a general sympathetic strike, which started on the 15th of May, 1919. So the Winnipeg general strike began with 11,000 unionized workers. So to put that in context, UMFA has 1,200 members, right? So even just that unionized part was much larger. But the number of strikes soon swelled to 35,000 workers, as non-unionized laborers also walked off the job. They withdrew their labor in what is known as a sympathy strike. This is a kind of strike, as Julia outlined on Monday, that's known as a general strike, meaning that it was not just one workplace that was affected, but many. And as a result, the disruption and thus effectiveness is multiplied. Right? That's the difference between a general strike and a regular strike, or a legal strike like SSUMFA is on right now. So many of those non-union workers who swelled the numbers from 11,000 to 35,000 and who joined the strike were actually women and recent immigrants living in the city's North End. And as the strike continued, workers across the country, from Victoria to Nova Scotia, also decided to strike in solidarity and for their own better wages and working conditions. Bosses and politicians soon called the strike wave of 1919 Winnipeg-itis and worried that the disease of workers standing up for themselves en masse would spread even further. Again, in some of these photos, you can sense how big some of these actions were, right? At the top is a picture of the strike committee, okay? And below is a picture of strike supporters downtown by Portage and Main. I don't even think there were as many people celebrating that the Jets were coming back to Winnipeg at Portage and Main than were here supporting the Winnipeg general strike, just to give you a sense of how large this was. Now, despite the impressive display of solidarity that May and June, divisions still existed, as they exist in many strikes and conflicts. Not everyone chose the same side or were working in unison for the greater good. Some strikers reinforced notions of white supremacy by advancing their demands as the rights of white, Anglo-Saxon, and loyal British subjects. And this excluded some Black railway workers in the city who were actually supportive of the strike, okay, but are not represented, for example, in the strike committee and some of the photos that you will see. Strikers also failed to make connections with the struggles of other dispossessed and exploited groups, such as the Anishinaabe community of Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, who are experiencing a major land loss due to the construction of the Winnipeg Aqueduct, which was happening at the same time, as Adele Perry, who gave the teaching talk yesterday, has outlined in her work on the building of the aqueduct. This was a missed opportunity to build strong relations of solidarity among different groups to fight, win, and leave no one behind. And we need to always remember that when you're on strike, that we're really stronger together and need to find ways to link our struggles with the struggles of others. And I know for those of you who've been down to the legislative building, SSUMFA members have been picketing there every day and have also been working in solidarity with the Sacred Fire that has been going on since the summer to raise awareness about missing and murdered Indigenous people, as well as the search for unmarked graves at many former residential schools. And there has been ongoing dialogue between these different groups. So if you go to the ledge, remember that different struggles are always connected, and that is our job to make those connections. Okay, on the other side of the strike, Winnipeg's political and business elite formed what's known as the Citizens Committee of 1,000. There were not 1,000 members, probably not more than 100, but they wanted to make themselves seem big and scary. And they created this group in part to further foment divisions amongst workers, to try and divide and conquer and defeat the strike. That was their aim. And they had every reason to believe that such anti-labor tactics could work, right? That their appeals to racism would undermine solidarity. At the time, the city's unions were mostly skilled and British in character. They generally did not include the large portion of Eastern immigrants living in the North End. Also, a few months earlier, ugly crowds in Winnipeg had assaulted immigrants in the city, claiming they were threatening jobs at a time where jobs were scarce. And the war helped kind of fuel this anti-immigrant sentiment, even though British people, of course, were also immigrants, but I'll bracket that for the moment. Some people of British origin who readily went off to fight for freedom and democracy and the British Empire in the battlefields of Europe felt that workers who stayed behind were foreigners and slackers. That was the language that they were using. Back in Canada, immigrants became easy targets for returned soldiers who faced an uncertain economic future as they struggled to find jobs. So the Citizens Committee used control of the press, right? They had the resources and money to be able to create their own newspaper, the Winnipeg Tribune, and they published all sorts of racist cartoons, tried to paint the strike as a foreign communist plot to overthrow capitalism and defeat Canada. All of this was done as a way of trying to undermine the public's support of the strike. So we always need to be wary of how bosses and politicians and the press portray strikes and workers' demands for justice. They are by no means neutral, and we need to use our critical thinking skills to determine which side information is coming from, which side does that information support. So just like when U of M administration sends out those emails threatening your holiday breaks, or the media publish obvious spin stories fed to them by administration or PC staffers. We need to be very critical of this kind of information. Now, one way to consider the divisions that existed in 1919 and think about the different sides is to look at U of M's connections to the strike, right? And how those divisions played out among students and alumni and even staff. Okay, so this is some more original work that I've tried to put together for today's talk. So many U of M alumni actually went on to play prominent roles in the strike. And I'm just going to quickly mention a few here. So starting at the top left, William Ivins, BA 1906, MA 1909 from U of M, was a key member of the strike committee. He was the editor of the Western Labor News, which effectively became the strike bulletin, spreading information, helping people stay connected, sort of like the social media of the day. And he was also involved in the Labor Church, which was sort of a reform-based pro-worker church that often spoke during the strike and tried to bring people on board with the strikers. To his right, I think I got that. I think I got that correct. J.S. Woodsworth, okay, BA 1896 from U of M, was also a strike leader, a Methodist minister working in the same kind of tradition as Ivins. And he actually replaced Ivins as the editor of the strike bulletin or the Western Labor News towards the end of the strike. Over to his right, this is interesting. This is Marcus Hyman. Okay, he was a lawyer that defended strikers. Interestingly, he defended Moses Solomon Almazoff. Okay, he was a philosophy and economics student at U of M who had immigrated from Russia, who the government tried to deport for being a foreign agitator because he supported very openly the strike. Hyman successfully used his law skills, which he got from the U of M, to defend this U of M student who supported the strike. And as a result, Almazoff was not deported. So that's an interesting connection. Okay, and then towards the bottom, after the strike, Hugh Amos Robson, okay, a lawyer and civil servant who received his law degree from the U of M in 1914, actually chaired the Royal Commission that was called after the strike to investigate its causes and figure out, was it a foreign communist plot or was it something else? And Robson actually concluded that it was not, in fact, a revolution plotted by foreign agitators, but a strike caused by the refusal of employers to recognize the fair demands of workers. Sound familiar? And Robson Hall on campus at U of M today is named after Robson. Now, as I was doing the research for this talk, I found, interestingly, in 2019, the centennial of the Winnipeg General Strike, the U of M actually wrote a press release celebrating these brave alumni who were, according to their title, fighting for change, right? Kind of celebrating U of M's connections to the Winnipeg General Strike. Everybody likes to be on the side of justice after the fact. And U of M here is celebrating those connections to the Winnipeg General Strike. But not all U of M students and alumni and staff supported the strike. This was not mentioned in the U of M's press release in 2019. So other people connected to the University of Manitoba chose a different side. They chose to back the bosses and political elite in trying to crush the strike. So engineering students from the U of M, for example, were recruited as scab labor to operate powerhouses and sweep streets and collect garbage as city workers were on strike. So these were scabs or those who were performing the work of striking workers, thereby negating some of the power of the withdrawal of labor power, right? Others were recruited for more nefarious purposes, including being hired by the Citizens Committee to become night watchmen, who worked with special constables, which are essentially hired thugs, to crack down on striker gatherings, marches, and parades, to intimidate them into giving up the strike. So according to one source, quote, several hundred university students, okay, so it's not just a couple, were caught up in this work, including many of them working on Bloody Saturday, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So I think that's a pretty crappy summer job, if you ask me, but there you go. And it wasn't just U of M students that were connected to choosing this other side. So Easton Kenneth Williams, here on the right, who lectured at the Manitoba Law School affiliated with the U of M, and later served as a member of the U of M Senate and was given an honorary doctorate from the U of M in 1953, was a key member of the Citizens Committee, which orchestrated anti-strike activity, including using and abusing the law to arrest and charge strike leaders, including trying to deport Almazov. So interestingly, again, U of M chose not to celebrate these connections to the strike in their centennial celebrations. U of M, 100 years later, chose to side with those who supported the strike and not talk about these other U of M students and staff that worked on the side of the bosses, political elite, and the police. And that's somewhat not surprising because the longer historical legacy of the strike, I think more people have sided with the strikers and that being the right side of history. And you can see this dotted throughout the city of Winnipeg with multiple monuments, art projects, and even a play and Hollywood movie kind of celebrating the strike and siding with them historically. So as time passes, it becomes clear that the side of justice always prevails, or most often prevails. People like to be on that side after the fact. So although strikes can divide, it's true, they also have this incredible ability to bring people together and build bridges. And I personally experienced that over the past few weeks, meeting a number of my colleagues that I haven't met before, working in solidarity with students, coming out to these teach-ins. I feel that immense amount of solidarity that we have. And as a result of that solidarity, it's very dangerous for bosses and politicians, right? And so those attempts to turn workers against each other in 1919 during the strike mostly fell flat. Racism did not disappear entirely, of course, but solidarity won the day. The thousands of non-union members who joined the strike were largely, it seems, the same immigrants the Citizens Committee were trying to demonize and use to discredit the strike. Also, the returned soldiers seemed to divide along class lines. Huge numbers of rank and file soldiers stood beside their civilian fellow workers on strike. This is what made it a general strike. This was not just an uprising of a small group of workers, but a revolt of the city's working class, more or less as a whole. And people started to choose to be on the side of the strikers, not just because they wanted the building and metal trades workers to win, but they wanted working people to have a greater say in society. So Winnipeg workers, whether skilled or unskilled, men or women, immigrant or Canadian born, fought together, and that was their power. The strike was so successful and clogging the economy of Winnipeg, bringing it to a standstill, that elites, not just in Winnipeg, but around Canada, started to get very nervous that Winnipegitis would spread. So they organized to try and crush the strike. Indeed, the Winnipeg General Strike, it lasted for 6 weeks, but it ended in defeat as a result of that organizing from the other side. Employers and state officials worked to contain the strike, to undercut strike leaders, right? They labeled the strikers as enemy aliens and foreign radicals, and even arrested many of them on dubious charges and tried to have them deported. When that didn't work, finally on June 21st, Bloody Saturday, state officials authorized violence. They got desperate. Special constables and the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, and it would seem some U of M students, attacked strikers and their supporters during a peaceful demonstration. And you can see some of the photos from this terrible day. 2 people eventually died. Almost 100 were injured as the Northwest Mounted Police actively shot into the crowd of supporters. As a result, the strike was called off a few days later, ending officially on June 26th. Fearing the spread of socialism and participatory democracy, municipal, provincial, and federal officials colluded with local elites, assembled anonymously in the Citizens Committee to undermine and crush the strike. Nevertheless, the Winnipeg General Strike proved to be a profoundly politicizing event. Many workers, used to being disconnected and isolated from one another in the daily grind of work, now gathered freely in open air meetings at Victoria Park, which was on the edge of the Exchange, to listen to music and political speakers and to discuss the most recent developments of the strike as detailed in the daily strike bulletin. And here, this is Roger Bray, one of the strike leaders, addressing a crowd in Victoria Park. And here you can see sort of the immense gatherings that would be happening on a day-to-day basis. You didn't have social media back in 1919, so you had to show up to Victoria Park, get a copy of the daily strike bulletin, to listen to speakers and catch up on information. And workers really reveled in this spirit of participatory democracy, much deeper than they had ever known. Organizing the strike and keeping it going for 6 weeks showed workers their capacity to be more than cogs, just making profit for their bosses. And in many ways, I think in today's strike, social media and events like these teach-ins are providing a kind of virtual space for us to come together in the spirit of Victoria Park, to kind of listen and learn from each other, in addition to meeting one another on the picket lines. And I really value the work that students are doing to kind of create those spaces for us. Moreover, the political consciousness strikers developed in 1919 fundamentally shifted the political landscape in Winnipeg and beyond in the years and decades afterwards. Whatever the outcome of the strike itself, strikers were determined to have a greater say in what the future was going to look like. I think that's something that we can hold on to. So the strikers' opponents, though, were equally determined to prevent that kind of broader empowerment. This is the struggle piece that you see. So some of the immigrants arrested in the suppression of the strike were slated for deportation under a very quickly revised Immigration Act. Not all of them were able the lawyers were able to prevent this. The most articulate and public British Canadian leaders were also tried in court, right? They were arrested and put on trial, not for their actions during the strike, but for their ideas, right? That led to Winnipegitis and that were seen as very threatening, right? Greater power for working people to shape the political and economic climate of Manitoba seemed very dangerous to the Citizens Committee. And as a result, they manipulated the law to try and put them on trial, to discredit them. But it kind of didn't work in a way. The city's legal elite made sure that the defendants were convicted, okay? But the prosecution's victory rang hollow. Of those charged, 5 actually were elected in the provincial and federal elections in the very short term that followed. 3 of them were elected to higher office while still in prison, right? So although the avenue of the general strike tactic closed, working class Winnipeggers chose other routes, following the lead of the Independent Labour Party, the Communist Party, and the One Big Union in struggles that followed in the years afterwards. A dynamic left-wing political culture that had its roots, sure, before the general strike, grew even richer afterwards as workers turned out in droves to speak, to attend plays and concerts and marches, and to the ballot box to have their voices heard, to shape the political economy of Manitoba. The election maps of the city portrayed a stark contrast between the working class neighborhoods, right, where different labor-friendly parties kind of held sway, and wealthier areas where conservatives continue to rule. And you can still see some of those divisions in the city today, although of course they change over time. Winnipeg Labour also maintained its militant image in the years that followed the strike. In the midst of the Great Depression, as relief camp workers mounted the famous On to Ottawa trek, the federal government's decision to attack the trek in Regina in 1935 was motivated in part by a fear of the deep well of support that awaited the trekkers in Winnipeg as a result of the strike. At the end of World War II, a new wave of labor militancy forced governments to finally concede a degree of union security through the certification of unions, mandatory collective bargaining, and dues checkoff. But labor paid a price for these gains. The post-war settlement, as sometimes it's called, and Julia discussed some of these issues, between labor, capital, and the state was kind of a double-edged sword. No doubt with an eye to the experience of Winnipeg in 1919, governments banned sympathy strikes and imposed harsh penalties, fines, and imprisonment, for example, for violations. And to this day, general strikes are effectively outlawed. Nevertheless, workers in Canada mounted mass strikes in 1972, 1976, and in the 1990s. Now, these attempts to constrain workers' ability to use their solidarity in a general strike stems in part from the state's fear of that kind of worker power that we see here on display in 1919. No one wanted to catch Winnipegitis. So the ripple effects of that one strike in Winnipeg, Manitoba are still being felt. And it has this much larger, wider legacy, which is important to remember when deciding which side are you on in these kinds of conflicts. Okay, to conclude, and then on to some questions from you folks. Strikes are, of course, never easy, but learning the lessons from past labor battles, such as the Winnipeg General Strike, I think can help re-energize our efforts to build a better world. Indeed, reflecting on the past can help working people today understand not only where we have been and where we're going, but also where we want to go and how we can get there together. Hopefully, it won't take the U of M 100 years to realize that faculty and students and community members fighting for a fair deal and for the integrity of our institution are on the right side of history. For now, I know which side I'm on. I'm with UMFA, and students supporting UMFA. I'm on the side of students and people who care about the power of education and the importance of public services, and those who want to make the world a better place. As UMFA members, we know our working conditions are students' learning conditions, and that it will be our students who will go on and shape Manitoba and the world for generations to come. That's why I'm going to continue to strike until we win. Okay, thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions about the 1919 or 2021 strikes that you might have.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was wonderful. One thing that I found really interesting from your talk was this concept of democracy, just in the sort of gatherings in common areas and public spaces and sharing ideas. And that's sort of different than the type of democracy that most of us might be familiar with, just maybe thinking about electoral democracy. That doesn't impact something like a strike too much. We can all just decide to go out and vote for it to be over. But I'm wondering, like, compared to now, and obviously COVID is part of this, but these discussions are sort of happening in public, but in a sort of atomized way on social media, where we're likely already sharing ideas with people that agree with us already. So maybe before that became such a common thing, how long did this, trend is the wrong word, but was it common for these big gatherings to happen around these types of events leading up to the advent of social media and the internet?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question, Travis, because, you know, Victoria Park was very quickly dismantled in the aftermath of the strike.